Have you ever been in a cramped spot with someone you don't like? Maybe shared an elevator with that one annoying coworker? Well, it could always be worse. That annoying coworker could also be an angry, venomous snake. The ancient Roman poena culiae, or punishment of the sack, involved placing the victim into a large canvas sack. At this point, a dog, cat, monkey, rooster, and snake would then also be tossed into the sack, before the sack itself was thrown into a river. The idea behind poena culiae was that as the sack slowly filled with water, the frightened and aggressive animals inside would tear each other and the unfortunate victim stuck in the middle apart. The exact animals thrown into the sack varied from punishment to punishment. After all, why waste a perfectly good monkey when you could just use an extra rooster? This nasty punishment was most often meted out to those accused of parricide, which is the crime of slaying one of your parents. I'm not exactly sure why slaying your parents would net you a timeout in the danger sack. Doesn't seem like an especially ironic or fitting punishment. Maybe it's funnier if you speak Latin? Either way, this barbaric punishment fell out of style in the 3rd century CE in Rome, only to be reinstated by Emperor Justinian 200 years later, where it remained in use for another 400 years. Definitely redefines the meaning of getting the sack. Scafing reviews. If you were told you were going to be experiencing the boats in ancient Persia, you might expect a pleasant trip lounging along the Karun River, lazily eating dates. In reality, you'd be in for one of the most disgusting experiences imaginable. Devised in the 5th century BCE, scaphism, also known as the boats, was a punishment that started off sweet. Literally, the victim was fed a large amount of sweet honey and milk or cream, and things got considerably less comfortable after that. If the victim was lucky, they would be tied up inside a boat. If they weren't, they'd be placed inside a boat before another upturned boat was placed on top of them, so that their arms, legs, and head were sticking out. The boats were then pushed into a lake or swamp, and this is where things get nasty. The sickly mixture of milk and honey would eventually cause the victim to vomit or relieve their bowels. In addition to being gross and causing dehydration, the sugary contents of the victim's excretions would also attract insects incredibly quickly. Over the next few days, the victim would slowly starve while their body was consumed inside the boat by flies, maggots, and any other awful swamp creatures you can imagine. If you'd done something really bad, your boat would be pulled back ashore so you could be force-fed more milk and honey to drag out this process even longer. Plutarch, a Greek essayist, recorded an instance where a Persian soldier killed a nobleman and survived 17 days of scaphism before succumbing to his punishment. Man, and I thought an hour of detention after school was a cruel sentence. Rats. Throughout human history, wherever people have gathered in large numbers, rats have followed, living in our homes rent-free and eating our delicious trash. It's only fair we put them to work. In modern times, rats are mostly employed as test subjects in scientific research, but if we jump back a few hundred years, these pernicious pests were proliferators of pain. In the 17th century, the Dutch would place a rat on a prisoner's abdomen before securing a pot or half-cage over the rat. The pot would then be heated, and the rat, eager to escape, would begin to burrow through the prisoner's skin. Of course, this isn't the only way we humans have utilized rats to hurt each other. Of all the awful places you could end up in medieval England, the Tower of London had to be the worst. The infamously gruesome prison made use of a special rat dungeon, which I'm sorry to say wasn't for imprisoning criminal rats. The waters of the nearby River Thames would often rise in the rain and sweep the rats of the city into the dungeon, where they would scare and even nibble on the chained-up prisoners. Around the same time in Germany, rats were being starved and then placed in a cage which would then be fastened around the victim's neck. I'm sure you can imagine what the cramped, hungry rats did next. Yikes. Or should I say rats? Well, between being eaten alive by rats and being eaten alive by insects, which do you think is the worst punishment? For the rats, hit the subscribe button, and for the insects, hit that like button. All done? Great. Now what horror have we got next? What a trip. Let's take a break from physical harm for a moment to talk about psychological torture. And no, I don't mean watching a modern Simpsons episode. Chinese water torture is a form of punishment and interrogation that involves restraining someone's arms and legs before placing a bucket full of water above their head. The bucket has a small pinprick-sized hole in the bottom that drips water onto the victim at regular intervals. The victim is usually positioned so the drops hit them on the forehead, which along with your fingertips is one of the most sensitive areas of the body. While this may not sound so bad at first, it could last for weeks. As the process goes on, it becomes more and more maddening because the victim is unable to think or concentrate on anything other than the constant dripping. Thoughts become incoherent, other sensations fade away until all that's left is the hammering feeling of... In some instances, the victim would be told the water contained poison that would deteriorate their mind over time, compounding feelings of anxiety and paranoia. In all likelihood, the Chinese are getting undeserved flack as the pioneers of this punishment, as its use was first documented in Italy. In the late 15th century, Hippolytus de Moselle wrote that the punishment was inspired by the way natural water would slowly erode stones over time. It's thought the word Chinese was added simply to make it seem exotic and mysterious, like the ye olde equivalent of smart water. Since then, it's been utilized all over the world, from the American Civil War to Spanish inquisitors in the 16th century, who also experimented with forced drinking as punishment. Ugh. Well, at least they didn't have access to sparkling water. White light. Our next punishment is known as white torture, or sometimes white terror. To understand white terror, however, we first need to understand solitary confinement. Solitary confinement is a form of punishment frequently used against prisoners today that involves placing them in a small cell devoid of human contact or activities. In the United States, solitary confinement is used to reprimand behavior as major as starting fights, but also as minor as having extra rolls of toilet paper in your cell. Most solitary cells are just 6 by 9 feet in size, smaller than a standard car. Keep in mind this imprisonment can last for days, weeks, or months, resulting in extreme distress and psychological damage. Because humans are naturally social animals, our brains often invent stimuli when they're deprived of it. Extended solitary confinement is known to lead to hallucinations, paranoia, depression, nightmares, disassociation from your body, and even physical pain and nausea. One inmate in solitary for 23 days once said, "One night I heard someone screaming far away. Then I realized it was me." Though it's hard to imagine, there's actually an even more extreme version of solitary confinement: white terror. The victim is placed inside a stark, bright white room. Everything in the room is white and non-reflective, from the bed to the toilet, and even the victim's clothes. Bright lights are positioned in such a way as to eliminate as many shadows as possible and make the victim feel as though they are trapped in a white void. Even mealtime is no escape from the encompassing whiteness, as they are fed white rice from white bowls, which is silently slid through a hatch in the white door. These meals occur at random times, so the victim is unable to gauge how much time has passed since their imprisonment. In the white room, it's hard to tell if it's been days or weeks since your last conversation. Oh, and silence is another awful part of this punishment. The only way prisoners can communicate with guards is to slip a white sheet of paper under the door. But even then, the guards are instructed to wear cushioned shoes that don't produce any noise when walking about. The effects of the white room are the complete, overwhelming deprivation of anything, except one's own mind, which quickly deteriorates. Just 15 minutes in the white room is said to lead to feelings of paranoia and anhedonia, the inability to feel happiness. White torture was supposedly invented by the CIA in the 1970s for utilization against the Viet Cong. Iran still uses white torture today, and one detainee put it thusly: "After 3 days, I wanted words, anything, even swearing, even interrogation. Considering I can't make it 5 minutes without looking at my phone, I hate to think how quickly I'd crack." Severe feather warning. If you've ever seen an old cartoon, you may be familiar with the practice of tarring and feathering. This old-timey punishment involves slathering the victim in hot tar before dumping a bag of feathers over them, making them look like a giant chicken. The obscure punishment was first used in the 12th century by sea captains as a way of punishing thieves in the English Navy. Centuries later, in the 1760s, it was rediscovered by colonial Americans and became a favorite form of mob justice, usually employed against folks that had simply offended the sensibilities of a community. Unlike other punishments discussed today, tarring and feathering wasn't meant to end the victim's life so much as hurt and humiliate them. Pine tar was often used as it has a relatively low melting point of around 130 degrees Fahrenheit. This means the tar becomes goopy and sticky long before it becomes lethally hot, but would also still be hot enough to cause burns and blisters. These blisters did hold the risk of becoming infected and causing worse problems down the line, but also served as a visual indicator you'd been punished long after you'd defeathered yourself. Tarring and feathering was often carried out in a public forum before the victim was paraded through the streets, where they could be mocked by onlookers. Disempowerment, humiliation, and pain were the ultimate goals of this punishment. Though the practice fell out of fashion as official state-mandated punishment, it turns out that it's pretty hard to put a lid on mob justice. In America, there are reports of men who refused to serve in the First World War being tarred and feathered in the streets. The barbaric punishment even popped up as recently as 2007 in Ireland, where someone dealing illicit substances was tied to a lamppost before being tarred and feathered by vigilantes. I better not get on their bad side. I've never looked good in feather jackets.